Okay, so I think we're live on YouTube, which is great. So I think we can start. So there's been a lot of research done that shows that cities have been designed by men and therefore tends to the needs of men. There's been a failure to consider women in the planning and design process, which has resulted in cities being unsafe for women. It has also produced environments where it's hard for women to strike a work-life balance. Urban planning is often gender blind, failing to recognize or respond to the different ways in which women and men experience urban spaces and their differing practical and long term needs. Planning for women's safety requires good urban governance, with women taking part in neighborhood and city decision making. A female perspective on urban planning is therefore essential to achieve an environment that is comfortable and secure for everybody. So that's kind of a little introduction of what we're going to talk about today. And at this point, I'd like to introduce Nana. I'll do a quick bio intro, but I know she's going to talk more about herself and what the work that she's doing. So Nana is a lecturer, researcher, and writer who currently works in London. She teaches at the Department of Architecture and Landscape at Kingston School of Art. She has exhibited her work worldwide and won a variety of awards. Her key interests are around between housing, landscape, and urbanism, and she's drawn the complexities of the modern African city and the relationship between the individual artifact, the house, and its connections to the collective, the fabric, and the structure of the city. So I'm going to hand over to Nana to tell us more about what she's been doing and also bring some light to this idea of a gendered perspective within the city and within architecture.
Thank you very much, Olamide. So just before I start, I'm just going to share my screen, and I hope this goes without any glitches. Full screen. Can you all see that? Perfect. But first, I'd like to say thank you so much to Olamide for inviting me to be part of Open House Lagos. I think this is a brilliant platform and a brilliant organisation, and the work that they're doing in kind of opening up cities, especially on the African continent, is so crucial. We see evidence of that today in the kind of civil unrest that's going on in our cities, and part of that is about making a city that's equitable for everyone. And so today I'll be presenting some of the work I do in trying to create and establish that equitable city. So I'll start with introducing myself briefly. So as Olamide said, I'm a designer, lecturer, writer and critic based in London currently. I graduated my Masters in Architecture in 2016, and since then have worked in London for various practices. I currently practice a Cara Creative casting architect, working in housing design and looking at ways to improve social housing in London and working strongly with communities. So the projects I work on normally go through a co-design process and work with residents directly to design their future homes. I also teach architecture. So I've been at the University of Kingston in the Department of Architecture running the second year unit for the last 4 years. And I've also recently joined the Architectural Education School of Architectural Association School of Architecture, teaching Diploma 6. And I also write in my as part of my practice. So part of that started, my teaching practice actually started through a summer school funded by Kingston University, Drawing Matter and the Royal Fine Art Trust. And for me, that was an integral experience to kind of getting into teaching, but also actually bringing, so the program was for 17-year-olds just about to go into their last year of A-level who were considering studying architecture or design, or taking up a degree in the built environment. And part of that was really about opening up that kind of access to who actually gets to even consider architecture as a viable profession for them. So that was a really important school to be part of. Aside from the teaching and practicing, I also I also work in writing and communication and essentially design culture. And I think that for me is a really important part of my practice, because the part about making an open city and a kind of more inclusive city is about actually changing design culture. And that goes from conversations we have right through to kind of policy making and urban city planning. So part of that work, I'm one of 5 new architecture writers, a program founded by the Architecture Foundation in London, which aims to bring more diverse voices to architectural critique, which for too long has been quite European-centric and quite well male-dominated. So parts of the things, so I'll talk a bit about the work that I do with new architecture writers. I also contribute regularly to Register Podcast, which is run by Kingston University. And this year, I'm also one of 50 advocates for the Black Females in Architecture, a advocacy group based here in London. And I also run a design studio practice called Studio Nyale with my collaborator, Bushra Mohammed. And we set up the kind of partnership, we describe it as a way to investigate the African typology, the compound house. So I'll talk a bit about that also in this presentation. So first up is, as I said, I'm part of New Architecture Writers, and as so far we've held 2 events. The first one being in August, July 2019. But that event was called Drawing the Edge to the Centre, and it was a panel discussion held as part of the Royal College of Arts summer program within the architecture school. And that was really about creating a forum for discussion. So we curated a series of panel discussions, live interviews, and just open forums. And part of this was really about engaging with built environment professionals, but seeing that as a kind of wider narrative. So talking to Hanif Kara here, who is a director at AKT2, but also the program also included people that work in communication. So we talked to Stan's podcast. We also spoke to developers, architects, and the idea of the conversation was to bring together a wide range of expertise in the built environment, but also have a more open conversation about how we make the built environment, how we curate it, how we sort of collaborate as practitioners in the built environment. And just this October, NAW also curated a live takeover of the Architecture Foundation's channels. We put on a month-long series of events titled Depends on Your Perspective. And it was really about challenging the face of architectural criticism and really asking, well, what's the new face of architectural critique? It's not, how does it represent a diverse population that we live in London especially? How can we make it more centered, more inclusive for everybody? So that's women, people of color, people of different ethnicities and sexual orientation. All of those things are questions we're asking, because we feel that tackling these questions also improves the balance and openness of our cities. Who actually gets to write about them? Because who writes about the built environment controls the narrative of that. And so we need to make that much more inclusive. As I mentioned, I also teach at Kingston University, and together with the research Bushra and I undertake, we also teach a second year studio along with Michael Badu and Mary Vaughan Johnson for last year, and I'm currently teaching with Matthew Blunderfield this year. We started this project and we're very lucky to be supported by Kingston, which has been an incredible supporter for Bushra and I. And this, so last year we taught a studio called The Compound House, the Course of Empire, The Compound House. And that was really based on our research. But we also, when we started our research project in 2019, we were really keen not to make a kind of closed door project where you kind of research quietly behind the scenes and then share it at some point. We really wanted it to be an educational experience for us ourselves, but also for students, and to really change the narrative behind African architecture by making it more visible and by having conversations about it. And we felt that there was no better way to do that than to teach that agenda within a studio. So we were lucky enough to have an incredible group of students, and we spent a week in Ghana in November 2019 on our study trip. We were hosted by lots of very, very generous people and lots of very generous organizations. But that work really inspired a different way of thinking about architecture within the studio, especially a second year where students have started to form kind of their own interests and making observations about the built environment quite critically. It was important that we diversified the things that they refer to, their references, the things that they consider architecture. So this page here is showing an example of student work produced, and this lovely project is by a student, Jemima Alton Shanks, who was really interested in the kind of everyday conditions that she saw in Accra and in Kumasi. So her project becomes inspired by the idea of the umbrella, which is a kind of typical Ashanti symbol, but also provides direct comfort on the street from the harsh sun. So she really started to understand these sort of everyday conditions where people live within the city and try to make an architecture that was influenced by this and really get to grips with the culture of openness and sharing and community that's established in Accra. We link to that, to our teaching is also, we see our teaching studio as also a means for developing our design research. So we also visited the Adjusa Besiasa Shrine House, which is one of the buildings that Bushra and I are currently looking at. Again, we were supported by incredible people, the Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology, and also Mr. Kantanka, a Ashanti historian. And he, going to projects like this was so critical to us because it was about kind of actually, look, Africa has some amazing buildings, some amazing architecture that actually the West could learn a lot from. The kind of embedded sustainability of local construction methods, but it was also about saying on the other side, actually, we as Africans have a lot that we should be looking at in terms of our own built environment and understanding the value of it. And so, as I've mentioned, I run Studio Nyale with Bushra Mohammed. It's an interdisciplinary research, design and architecture partnership between the two of us. And it's really about kind of making space for our research to develop and seeing research as inherent to the practice of architecture as the delivery of buildings. Because if you can shape what is seen as interesting and important, then you can change the narrative of what we treasure and what we see as being of critical value. So at the moment, our research has been based in Ghana, looking at the different housing types. So we've looked at different compound housing types, and it started to curate and catalogue these with the hopes of really expanding the kind of knowledge base and putting it out there, making it visible so they can be studied and shared. But we also have hopes of expanding this project just beyond Ghana. So we're interested in the typology as it manifests across the continent. So we hope to carry on this research project, really looking at the broad ways in which you find the compound house all over the West, all over the African continent. It's we started this project because we both of us coming from an immigrant background and living as part of the diaspora community in London and in the UK, and being brought up in the UK, always felt a kind of lack for our own cultural understanding and heritage within the built environment. And through conversations, as we studied together, we realized that actually we started to ask ourselves, well, what is an African architecture? And that's a hard and tricky thing to define in a continent of 54 countries and so many different cultures and tribes. But what is common across all of those is the way in which we live. We live as a community, we respect heritage, and for us, our building fabric reflects that. And for us, we saw the compound house as the kind of most evident form of housing. So we really wanted to understand it and also then use it as a way to generate thoughtful responses to our urban cities, which have somehow kind of always looked west and kind of import these Western typologies that really offer little in terms of our understanding of how we live. And so we really wanted to see how these building typologies might contribute meaningfully to the development of our urban cities and also the suburban condition. As I mentioned, I'm also one of 50 advocates for the BFA in London, the Black Females in Architecture organisation. The BFA is a network that supports generations of professionals capable of senior roles in the existing practice and institutions. The BFA seeks to be inclusive as a network and really challenging and decolonizing oppressive structures and forces within the architecture profession. So why the BFA? Well, it's because at the moment, currently, Black female architects are hugely underrepresented in London and in the UK, but also probably also worldwide. And that's a problem for within the built environment, because if you exclude women, especially Black women, you will always fail to meet their needs as citizens of the cities in which they are part of. And part of that the questions start at education level and asking, well, who actually gets to access the profession, even as a student? And then who gets to move through their education and successfully complete and become an architect? And at the moment, you can see that that's hugely white and male. And so part of BFA's agenda is to really challenge these things and ask the critical questions about the barriers to our profession. It was founded by Neba, Alicia, Selassie, and Akua, who by chance meeting met in an event in London and realizing the kind of actually how rare it was to find 4 Black women at an architecture event, started this network. And the network has grown hugely. It now includes 350 plus members all over the globe, with the majority in London. It offers through its work and advocacy, it also campaigns for better education and access. So it runs CV workshop, portfolio workshops, and also more broadly, other types of events such as the book club, and really trying to create a kind of forum for Black women to thrive within the profession. And as I've said, it's about equity. So, and the network is growing, it's global. So this is Akua talking at a symposium in Melbourne, and really being a representative and striving for an equitable platform for Black women within the built environment. And lastly, the BFA's work is supported largely by donations. So if you want to carry on supporting the network, you can do so by donating to the donation part via the BFA's website. And so it's a bit of a whistle-stop tour on the things I do and the ways that I contribute as a woman in the built environment. But for me, when Olamide posed this question, I thought about, well, actually, how do we contribute to a more equitable environment for women and create an open city? And for me, that stretches across being present within the city, but also actually it starts from the kind of education and access all the way through to the kind of policy making. And if you can affect education and access and the practice, ultimately you can have more balanced conversations with policymakers and therefore drive drive a kind for a more inclusive city and a city that really serves everyone. And I strongly believe that if you create a city that serves women, you essentially create a city that serves everyone. So thank you very much for listening, and I hand back over to Olamide.
Thank you so much, Nana. That was really great. And I think that's a good point to end on in regards to kind of creating this equitable city and designing from a female perspective, and how that can actually lead to a more equitable city or equitable spaces. So before we do the panel discussion, I thought it might be quite nice to ask you, the audience, participants, what it means, what a female-led design city could look like. So I'm going to share my screen. It's going to be like an online poll, which we can all kind of do online. So hopefully I can do that. Just let me try and share my screen. This is, I don't know if everybody can see this. So you have to go to www.menti.com, and then you can put in this code 1575658, and hopefully it should work, where you can then kind of answer the question, and I will start seeing your answers kind of popping up here. So it'd be great to get, I mean, the more answers we get, the kind of more interesting conversation we can have around what we think a city designed for women could look like as well. So I'll give it a bit of time for everyone to do this, and hopefully we can start to see some interesting answers popping up. And if you're having any trouble, let me know, and then I can maybe help if possible. And maybe while we're doing that, I can introduce the panel. Okay, so I'm actually seeing answers popping up. So before I do that, maybe we can talk about these. So we can see inclusive, imaginative, safe, free, let's see, brighter, it's really interesting, thoughtful, brighter, like a shoe shop, brilliant. Imaginative, safe has obviously come up quite a bit because it's the largest one. Parks, I can see greener, inclusive, exciting. That's quite, I mean, we can keep going and we can save this later and people can see it later on. But well, yeah, that's colorful, brighter, equitable, yeah, thoughtful, and safe seems to be like coming up quite a lot, which I think is really important in any when it comes to women.
We may now proceed to the next checkpoint without fear of violence. We're going to protect every student at this school from harassment. Did she? I'm walking away from you.
I think we might have lost Olamide.
Oh, sorry guys, internet, I guess, failed me. And it's been fine all day, and then it's my session, and then it's it goes off as it does. Anyway, so I was trying to introduce the panel, so I'll do that now. All right, so we've met Nana. Another person on the panel is Dr. Taibat Lawanson. She is an associate professor in the Department of Urban and Regional Planning at the University of Lagos. She leads the Pro-Poor Development and Urban Management Research Cluster. She's also the co-director at the University of Lagos Center for Housing and Sustainable Development. She has conducted extensive research on issues relating to urban informality, livability, environmental justice, and pro-poor development. She has written and co-authored over 60 articles in peer-reviewed journals, books, and conference proceedings. She is a member of the editorial advisory board of Area Development and Policy Journal of the Regional Studies Association and international corresponding editor at Urban Studies Journal. And Tosin Oshinowo is the architect. She's an architect, designer, and director at CMD Design Atelier. She is a Nigerian architect, creative entrepreneur, public speaker and author. She's a graduate of architecture from Kingston College London and had her master's degree in urban design from the Bartlett School of Architecture. She's worked on a number of projects in various architectural firms in Europe and Africa. Tosin incorporated her own architectural design consultancy firm, CMD Design Atelier. She's also the founder and chief executive officer of lifestyle furniture brand, Ila, House of Lines. And she curated the second Lagos Biennale that happened last year. And then we have Stephanie Thiret-Baka, who is a practicing architect who has also engages in artistic and academic projects. She's the director and lead architect of design firm Studio Elementals in Lagos. She has worked internationally. Studio Elementals positions itself within the intersection of various territories, reacting to spatial diversity and cultural vibrancy with architecture and urban interventions. She has worked in Nigeria, Ethiopia, South Sudan, Liberia, and Iraq. And she's furthermore an EDGE expert and currently involved in issues of sustainability and green building practices and how they impact on the environment. And so I think I've introduced everybody, and Nana has done justice to herself. So I'll ask a couple of questions to the panel. And maybe the first question I'll ask is, in your own practices, where does gender play a role? So maybe I'll start with Tosin.
Great. Hello, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to be on the panel. How does gender play a role in practice? So I think first and foremost, it is quite a challenge to be a woman in architecture, but it's also a challenge to run a practice as a woman in architecture. And when I started practicing in Lagos, working for myself and not working for people, I think that was the first time I actually came across or understood the importance of gender in the workplace. Because you go beyond being a project architect, working when a commission has come into the company, and then you start to front, so you have to now deal with client liaise. And in dealing with client liaise, you are dealing in reality with a lot of men. So that was the first time I realized that my gender actually played a role. And in many cases, I won't say it's necessarily negative, but you are very conscious of it. You do know that you may not get a commission because nobody will say it, you are a woman. And they might just think, without realizing it, oh, she might not be able to handle this because of the scale. So I kind of noticed that. Then also, just generally, your interaction with the other consultants within the industry, between engineers and even the laborers on site. So there are a lot of challenges that come with being a woman. Now, being an employer is also a completely different situation. I realized that as a female architect practicing in Nigeria, I also seem to attract a lot of women, which is a good thing within the profession, because it means that the minute that you stand as a role model, people realize as well that if she can do it, I can do it as well. And I think that's also very powerful. And it's also very important. I think as a designer, I believe women are actually more empathetic as designers. And we consider things that all designers should consider space and think about the people who will use them. But women have a very sensual way of approaching this. The way a woman will think about designing a space for children will be very different than what a man would think about. I mean, building regulations will determine all these things, and there are references to check. But I think as women, we are very conscious of space. We are very conscious of how people will use it. We are very conscious of scale, the many different scales of humans that will use those spaces. And I think if there are more opportunities for women to show their skill set, I think that's also very, very important. So it's been a very interesting journey for me personally, and how as a woman you position yourself within that. How do you compose yourself as a woman within the workplace? Because there is also an expectation of a woman's manner and her character. We are, the minute, and you can even relate this even with politics, the minute a woman is very firm and fierce, there's always a negative connotation that's put towards that, whereas if a man is just getting on with his job, he's just getting on with his job. And our role is pretty significant. And I love what Nana said, how if you don't have Black women within the industry, you're missing out the opportunity to design for them. And even in our societies in Nigeria, where we make up roughly about 50% or even up to 60%, you know, we actually play a very significant role in terms of the end users. And it's really important that we actually have representation in how we design our spaces.
Thanks, Tosin. Thank you so much. That was really great. And I think the idea of representation is very important. I think I'd like to ask Stephanie the same question in regards to, within your own practice, where does gender play a role, especially in design? Because I like to, I mean, I know you've done things, and same as Tosin, like malls and kind of homes and different aspects, but has gender played a significant role within your own design work or practice?
Good afternoon, everybody, as well. I can't answer the question if men and women design differently, but the way they were brought up and socialized definitely impacts their way of designing. So men are often raised as superheroes that should accomplish their objectives, whereas women are often brought up to take care of the well-being of their surrounding and to be more empathic, as Tosin already mentioned. So it's not necessarily about aesthetic reasons, but really more about our upbringing and socializing. So in my own practice, I've noticed that a lot of planning approaches that are state of the art actually come from a long European history of planning approaches, which is usually the thought that the mind is the most important thing that needs to be catered to, and not necessarily the body or the nature or the human as a whole. And what that means is that architects and planners have come up with very geometric and mind-pleasing, nice on the paper designs that are often grid-like, that have been placed on top of cities and have caused a lot of destruction, as we can see in examples in New York City, for example, as they have established a lot of highway systems that have cut through existing city areas, but also in Paris with the Champs-Élysées cutting through the whole city. So I think this planning approach is something we have to be aware of and have to counter against and try to kind of dissolve and find a new approach of a more contextualized way of designing. So for me, that always has to start with an extensive research about the cultural setting, the environment, and the site specificities, and also about what is existing on sites. So for example, often what happens is if you have a lot of natural elements like trees or topography existing on the site, the first reaction would be to cut everything off and to start from a blank grid and start drawing. But that's kind of the easy way out. And I think the more natural and also sustainable way to deal with a situation like that would be to study what is there and then do it in a more natural and human-like way that also provides more well-being to spaces and to cities. So I think if we can adapt this more natural approach to planning, it would automatically lead to more livable cities and cities that are well planned for women, children, also men, and elderly, of course, and just everybody in the society.
Great, thank you, Stephanie. And that's great. You started talking about urban planning, because we're going to bring in Dr. Lawenson now. And I think the question I want to ask Dr. Lawenson is, in the previous discussion that we had, and I've been speaking a lot and talking a lot about this topic, it has come up where the idea of we do we even know that we're designing in a male-dominated way? Do men realize that they are designing not for the females in cities? And so my question is, how can we change this, and how do we make it more apparent that this is the situation at the moment?
Right, thank you, Olamide. Hello, everybody, and it's a pleasure to be in such distinguished company. I'll start by saying that male privilege is intrinsic. It's something you have to call out when you see it. Unfortunately, incidentally, at least in the context of Nigeria, we live in a very patriarchal society, and so the male privilege is endemic, and often if you don't call it out, people are not aware. So let's take the planning profession, for example. Usually you have, okay, I teach in a class, you could have in a class of 50, maybe there are 20 girls and 30 men. At graduation, usually the girls tend to do better, probably because in Lagos, people tend to hustle, so there are lots of guys doing other things apart from school. But when it comes to practice, out of the 20 who graduated, the 20 women who graduated, maybe 5 end up practicing. And then they go into the ministry, and then they are embedded in a very hierarchical system where the male voice and the male opinion is valued. The physical planning ministry in Lagos State government, for example, has never had a female commissioner. And the permanent secretary, who was a woman, was not a built environment professional. So how do you bring to the table, these sensitivities? Cities that are planned for women and children work for everyone. How do you raise the issue that, oh, it's all right to design the traffic route, like this, but why is there no pedestrian bridge, for example, across a 10-lane highway? It just doesn't occur to the man that, because he has a very basic route, a life journey of work home, or maybe work bar home, whereas the woman has to do multiple short journeys, and so will require that. So I think it's important that we call it out. The other thing we need to do is to encourage more women who are in the planning of built environment disciplines to actually move on to practice. If there are more women in the space, then there's a critical mass that can demand for change. And sometimes the change has to be aggressive, sometimes it has to be subtle. What I do in my own work is to make sure that for every team, I will look for a qualified female first, so that there has to be an intentional pushing the women out there, because women are competent, but they are not very confident. And so one has to, particularly in the built environment, so one has to be intentional about creating the platforms for women and girls within the built environment disciplines to show their agency. Another thing that I would like to talk about is, as it is in society, so it is, in the discipline. And that transcends, even practice. In my work in the university, we see it as well. There are very few women, and oftentimes you have to be aggressive before, your voice is heard or your opinion is taken. And then you have to set, these examples for those who are coming behind, because you get a lot of disillusioned young women, those who are, who take the chance, who decides to bite the bullet along the line. Disillusionment could set in, particularly when they have young families. It's very difficult carrying out the work of a built environment professional with a young family. And now that we're even moving into this virtual reality and all of that, it makes it more tasking. So the main thing I will say is that for women who have been able to kind of create a path or on the, a bit ahead on the pathway to creating these spaces or have a platform, it's important that you pull others along, you identify those who have potential, and you create an opportunity for them to shine. It's intentional. It has to be intentional because the men have taken over the space and nobody gives up power, by choice. Nobody shifts, nobody creates, nobody allows another to come into the space except, you demand for it. And sometimes you actually have to push a little to make that space, for others to come in. I'll stop here for now.
Thank you, Dr. Lawenson. And I think I'm going to pick up from where you left off there, which was about how to make that shift. And maybe, Nana, you can talk about what you are doing and maybe what the BFA is doing to basically make that shift in regards to putting women in positions where decisions can be made. Nana, are you still there?
I am, but I was muted.
Right.
Thank you. That's a great question. And so in some ways, I just carry on from where the other speakers have, what the other speakers have spoken about. And in some ways, for me, in my practice, I see that as a holistic way of doing this. It's through education, it's through changing design culture, and it's also through practice. So in education, the question that really led me to education was, going through architecture school and never really seeing anyone that looked like me teaching me. And that really bothered me because while you might have women, they're not Black women. And that there is a key difference there. I think that we need to understand intersectionality, that, these are important things. And actually seeing somebody that looks like you in a position that you aspire to is crucial. Not just for myself as a Black woman, but I think that that's actually benefits everyone. If other students of other races see a Black woman in a position of influence, of being the leader, they go out into practice with a different attitude to taking instruction from a woman that looks like me. So I think it's it's a long process but you have to start and I think the comments about being intentional are absolutely crucial, that you have to start with and be very intentional and direct in what you aim for. So in what I do in education, I'm very aware of the things I aim to achieve. That is, for me, creating an education that is much more inclusive for everyone. That is, abandons this idea of kind of universality. And I completely agree with Stephanie there, is a European invention. It's an invention that does not take into account that there are different types of people. So the universal figure who we're designed for is a white man. That is not actually the majority of the world. So how do we start to change these things? And then the other side of education for me is about representation. That if you have people that are of all different races, backgrounds, ethnicities, sexual orientation, gender orientation, it means that everyone can see themselves in the positions they aspire to. And then in practice, especially for me working in housing, I think this is really important, the question of the domestic space and who the domestic space is designed for. You would think that that's designed for women in the sense that we live in a patriarchal society, but even the domestic space does not really acknowledge the woman as an active participant in the home. It refers to her as a kind of the person that does the work, the person behind. And for me, that goes to questions as simple as how is an apartment laid out? What are the crucial spaces? I can't tell you how much it perplexes me, this idea of a kind of open plan kitchen in a West African on the West African continent, where most of our cooking is done outside. You're not pounding for food on your beautifully tiled floor, but you design this beautiful open plan kitchen. Where is the other side of the kitchen? Where is the other space that is made? Where do you wash clothes? You know, all these things, there's domestic work that is not actually accounted for in the design of our homes, really seeks to exclude women. And I think that that's really important. And then that carries on into the public sphere as well, that if you're not even considering it at the level of the domestic space where everyone should be equal, how do you even begin to do that at the kind of the kind of urban scale? So these are questions that I really am trying to grapple with in practice. And then through Studio Nyale, for Bushra and I, it's really about seeing women of color tell their own stories. So when we started the practice, we were really interested in, well, who's actually written about the compound house, who's writing about West African architecture or African architecture, and it's still white people writing about Africa. So always this idea of Africa as a site to be gazed at, to be looked at, to be seen from outside. It's really important that we change that narrative. Who gets to write about our histories? And for us, for Bushra and I, that's crucial to the work we do through Studio Nyale and our research work. And then through BFA, which I think is a wonderful organization, and I'm really honored to be able to represent them, because I think they've done an incredible job over the time that they've been around to really show that we are here and we matter and we design and we do it well. And so this thing of, not having, you'd ask people, well, why is your architecture team or your built environment team of consultants not diverse? And people will say, well, it's because I don't know anyone. Well, actually now here are 350 plus Black women. So where do we go from here? Why are we being excluded? And I think that kind of role of advocacy and presenting yourself within the profession is really key to how we start to make it and create cities that are much more equitable and representative. So I leave it there for now.
Great, thank you, Nana. And so I think I'm going to ask Stephanie a question now, and maybe about your work again and your own projects, and how do you put people first? I'm sure maybe you're not just designing buildings for women or for a specific gender, for a specific age group, but how do you get to understand who you're designing for, who will use the space, what is that process like? And then how do you make sure that those people are represented in your projects?
So I think that's a really good question, and it depends a lot on the client. And many times the client is not actually the end user of the project, which is where the first challenge already comes from. So ideally, before you even understand the program and the kind of spaces that you should include in the project, you need to have a very good understanding of the needs of the user. But that needs a participatory kind of planning process, and also a longer planning process that is inclusive of the final user. So now that also means that the planning process actually takes longer, and that you don't necessarily know the outcome beforehand. So that's something that is really a challenge in the existing capitalist economic system, where it's all about doing everything fast and on time. And especially in Nigeria and in Lagos, it is advised to just sit down 1 hour and do a few lines and you're done with it, finished. What's the big deal? Why does this take so long? Why do we need all of this? And I often find myself trying to explain and also educate clients that the outcome won't be truly, beautiful and inclusive, and it won't matter that much if you skip all of that process. And I think there needs to be a shift of thinking from this fast, only economically viable system to a more content-based and forward-thinking way of making projects.
Great.
But a long process.
Yes, and I think in urban, city making or urban planning, it's also an expensive process, is what we are told.
Really expensive process, and especially when it comes to green building techniques. For example, if you look at the LEED certification, they suggest a very long circular planning process where a lot of consultants are involved, and you negotiate with the neighborhood, and it's all planned out, and it sounds like a great process, but to make that possible in a context where planning budgets are already much lower than in other contexts, it's very hard to argue for. So it's really like in small steps that we can move towards the ideal situation.
Great, thank you, Stephanie. I'm going to go back to Dr. Lawrenson now about this issue of stakeholder engagement and the time it takes and the effort. And maybe you can convince us. I mean, I'm already convinced because this is what I am very passionate about, participatory governance and planning, but convince us on why this is so important when it comes to whether it's architecture, space design, space making, city making, as well.
Okay, I think I'll just give an illustration of a project that we did during COVID. We did a community resilience action plan, and because there were restrictions on movement, we had to use citizen science methodology, and so it was people within the community, those who were embedded in the community, that took data and all of that. And we took a deliberate decision to have only women as the citizen scientists. So we had a series of focus group discussions at the beginning, which were open, mixed forum. And during the meetings, the main, the main feedback we got from that meeting was that the community required an embankment because it is a flood prone area, and they have this perennial flooding and all of that. And the men were very, assertive in saying that that's what they need. And that, various, the ministry, the federal ministry, the state ministry had been coming over and again, and that was what was required. So we had that discussion, and we had taken cases going to be, how can you get funding for this big, embankment project? And then we took a step further and had this other meeting just with the women. And we asked them to validate, what happened on the open meeting. 6 women, and 6 of them said, actually, the flooding is not the main problem that we have. Flooding is seasonal, and an embankment would be good. But something that is more urgent is the school. The secondary school had been moved away from that community 10 years ago in 2010. And in the space of those 10 years, the women had been able to identify that a high rate of dropouts had increased crime in the area, had increased unskilled, unemployed youth, had increased security challenges in the area, and that children having to cross over the express to the other community where there was an alternative school had increased child mortality in the area. You understand? And, they were able to, link it. Incidentally, the school, was moved because of a flooding incident. But for them, the flooding is something they could adapt to, using their indigenous knowledge systems. But the need for education, which is actually more cross-sectional, to building their resilience, was identified early on. And we realized that it was a low-hanging fruit, and advocacy has started towards, giving them that opportunity. The women were at the larger meeting, but they did not speak out on what this concern was, because the voice of the men had drowned out, that concern. So I always say that it's not enough to be physically present. The voice also needs to be heard. And sometimes these mixed meetings are not, the best, the most productive in getting a full picture. So it's important to hear what people have to say, but it's also important to recognize and identify who is saying what.
Great, thank you so much. And I think, it's also, I think another thing that is quite, when people say things like, oh, it's expensive to do this, or it's, it takes too long. My answer is normally, well, if you don't do it, what you're going to end up with is that you're going to end up with this kind of white elephant project that either no one will use, or it won't be used in the way you've actually designed it to be. And then you're wondering why, crime rates have gone up or things like that in that area. And so I think it's really, really important that, as Dr. Lanson is saying, that everybody's voice is heard in this kind of situation, especially when it comes to city making and space making and architecture. I think I'd like to ask Tosin the last question before I open it up to the audience. And about this idea that ideas are gender free, and an architect or an architect's ideas are gender free. Is that, do you think that is true? Which means that, if what you're thinking, and I think you kind of touched on this a little bit, what you're thinking and how you design would be very similar to, how a man would design.
I think ideally what would be great is that ideas are gender free, but I don't believe they are. I don't believe they are. I think, and Chuka mentioned this in the comments, our upbringing determines how we think and how we perceive things. Even the study of architecture, the practice of architecture, the training of architecture is based on a series of experiences that you eventually curate and you evolve as a designer. It's so much of a soul search and an inner kind of expression that it cannot be separated from your experiences, who you are as a person. And because of that, no, I don't think it can be separated. I do believe, and I will still say this as I started, women are very empathetic in their creation of space. And I think it's about how they use space and thinking through that process of, how would I pick a cup? How would I open a door? What would I experience? Who are the other people involved in this process? Would it be safe for the children? Would it work for the man? That's a very female entity. It's very feminine. It's very matriarchal. I think the practice of design is to be genderless, but in reality, I don't think it is. We're in a very powerful position as women, and we should really make sure that we rise to the table and take it.
Fantastic, thanks, Tosin. And I actually want to pose this same question to a man so we can hear a male's perspective on whether ideas and design is gender free. So maybe we can call on Chuka to answer this question. Chuka, sorry to put you on the spot, but anybody who else might want to answer it can.
Okay. Okay, thank you for putting me on the spot. It's good. Funny enough, I find myself working more with women than men. And then don't misunderstand this statement. I seem to attract more women than men in the design world. But that is to come to me to interact design-wise. And I've never quite understood why. I'm very conscious of it. And so I've been trying to think how that's happening. What am I doing that's connecting? But there must be something I'm doing that's connecting. I find it, maybe it's that I'm looking for the alternative and I'm getting that and I just keep getting it and I can't, subconsciously, I'm okay with it. I think that's basically, what I have to add to what's going on this panel discussion. So yeah, I am doing well on my female inclusiveness. Yeah.
All right, Chuka, thank you.
Olamide, can I just add something to that? I think it would actually be very interesting to consider if you looked at buildings or you looked at designs, could you actually tell in the finished product if it actually is more feminine or masculine? You know, I think that could be an interesting, I mean, the reality is no building is delivered by one person. It's a team of people, but the logic, the concept, the initial design will always come from a very clear entity or direction. And is that feminine or masculine? I think that could be interesting.
I think just to offer something to that, to Tosin's comment, I think that would be really interesting to look at. But I also think that actually women have been designing we've been doing this. Part of the problem is the recognition that we've been doing this. So if you look at, for instance, the Pritzker Prize and the RIBA gold medals, which have been awarded to joint practices, women are never named on it. So Charles and Ray Eames, for instance, Ray is not on there, and there was a campaign to make sure she was restored. Or even the fact that in all the awards years, there's never been a Black woman nominated, or even a woman of color, for instance. And that's to say, what, women of color are not doing the work? That's not true. And then also, beyond that, it took up till last year for 2 women, Grafton, to be nominated as the people they're nominated, not in conjunction with a man. So I think that the question is actually, why are we not being represented? It's not like we've not been designing. And then I also want to just touch on the fact that actually design work is not just in an architect's office or in a planning department, but it's our everyday condition. So the market woman is a designer. The way that she chooses to display her goods, the way that she chooses to set up her interactions with people, that is all design, that is by design. And if we don't start to recognize the kind of inclusivity of the design process, we risk alienating others from thinking they're actually designers. I think that to live and to dwell in this world is an act of design. You curate your everyday life, and we need to be kind of broader in the what we consider design, because actually that would make it quite evident that actually women have already been doing this. We just want the recognition that we've been doing this.
Great, thanks, Nana. That's such a good contribution, and of course, but you know, the question still is, how do we kind of force that change? And as Dr. Lawrence said, sometimes it has to be forced. It's not just like, okay, we're going to sit passive and allow, and it's going to change somehow. You know, it has to. There has to be some kind of fight towards that.
I think you need to be deliberate. So where there are public contracts, for instance, you should be demanding an equal team. Or actually, it's not enough to just be equal. You have to go beyond that, because you're not going to repair years and centuries of disenfranchisement of women by being equitable in the first place. You have to actually go over to make sure that we can get to a position. So we need kind of public contract, especially, actually it should be public and private, but absolutely demand it in public contracts, because we are half of the public. And somehow we shouldn't have to, I always say, I will not beg for my role, because firstly, I'm competent, and I contribute to this public life. I am in the public. So why should women have to be seen to be kind or softly spoken or nice to be able to be in public positions? So I think we have to absolutely, you actually need legislation on this, because it doesn't change from the goodwill of people. We have history to prove that. You have to absolutely demand it through legislation and what we consider to be equitable. So that's my answer, legislate on it and demand it.
Thanks, Nana. Thanks. Chuka has his hand up. I think, Chuka, do you want to add something or question?
Yeah, I just wanted to add what Nana was saying. The thing is, if 50% of the public are women, so let's say it's a 50-50 thing. But the thing is, when you look at the profession, 50% are not women. And in addition, women drop out a lot. So I'm sure they're down to 10%. I don't know what it is. I'm not. Don't quote me. Now, whatever that means, it's a bit difficult to say that panels should always have 50% men, women. It will be very difficult even to fill up with the women anyway. So I think we should be very careful. It's almost as if, no, it shouldn't be 50-50, really. I mean, fairly. I like that she says you should go over and above to make the point. But perhaps going over and above to make the point is 30%. Sorry, I'm not trying to be, I'm being very,
I'm a big believer in striving beyond what is current and actually pushing towards imaginative. So I think that if we strike at 50 to 70, then perhaps we'll end up at 30, and that's where you start. And I don't accept that you start from the absolutely achievable. You have to strive beyond that. And part of it, I accept that is maybe fanciful on my part, but actually I think that you have to be fanciful if you want to imagine a more equitable future. That the only barrier to achieving these things is our own imagination. So we've got to allow ourselves to dream a little bit more.
Tosin, did you want to add something?
I would love to add something.
Okay, go ahead, Stephanie.
I think that women that have already received recognition have a great responsibility to also further other women's agenda and also to mentor other women to get into a position of power. Because what happens in other countries where the politics are discussing about making a mandatory 50% of women, for example, in board of directors of big companies, there's been a big outcry. But if those rules are not established, it means that the men in power always mentor other men that come up to be in power, and they groom them to come after them. And there seems to, I don't know why, but there seems to be a disconnect between men and women in this regard. And it would be great if women can do the same, and making sure that other women can rise to a similar level. So we need to all be aware of our responsibilities that we already have in where we are right now, what we have achieved. Being able to attend a panel like this and being able to practice in a professional world.
Yeah. Thanks, Stephanie. So I think we have a comment here from Mary Johnson. Mary, I mean, if you'd like to raise your hand or unmute, I'm happy for you to mention your comment, or I can read it out.
I'm unmuted now. Let me just.
All right, sure, go ahead.
Happy to. So I'm head of architecture and landscape at Kingston, and I work with Nana and have worked with Bushra as well on the project in Ghana. And what I just wanted to say was, I think the problem is very visible in education. We see more and more women entering into architectural education, but they don't follow the career after they graduate. So I think the problem is already within education. We have to change how we're teaching architecture. It's not only Eurocentric, but it's male-centric. And I think that has to shift. And this is something I'm really trying to do as hard as I can. And I think in this time period, it is the time of that change. And I think we need to do everything we can, and trying to recruit educators who are female and Black and of color, and is something I'm also very keen to do. So if anyone is interested, please let me know. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary. And actually we have, after this panel at 6 o'clock, we have a discussion titled, "Is there a problem with architecture education in Africa?" So,
yeah, and I'm gonna be there.
So yeah. I think that would be a good one to kind of continue these kind of discussions, because I mean, I'm really passionate about architecture, not architecture education. Well, I'm going to say architecture education because I feel like urban planning and architecture have to me, built environment kind of all go together. So, so for me, I mean, it's not just architecture, but the whole built environment education and how it's taught locally in Africa. So I think it would be really good if more people kind of join the discussion, and so we can kind of think about the problems, but also what are the solutions. So does anybody have any other comments or questions at this point? If not, I can ask my last questions to the panel and we can close, and then I can relax a little bit before the next session. Okay, so I'll ask my last question to everyone, and the question is, what's the next step? So, I mean, I'm hearing about education. I'm hearing about putting women in positions. I'm also hearing about making sure that the people in positions now know they have a role to play. So there's a lot of things that I'm hearing, but maybe from each of you, you can kind of say, this is kind of what I think should be done next in regards to kind of changing the way we're thinking about designing spaces, and also maybe what you think different stakeholders could play. So three of you are architects, Dr. Lamson is an urban planner, but also there are people who are just, women, market women, people who work in businesses. What kind of roles could each kind of person play? And I think we'll start with, I'll just go with my list in front of me. We'll start with Nana. You're muted.
I mute myself. So what's next? Well, I think if I can summarize in kind of 3 points, it's identify the problem, propose actions for the problem, and then dream and further your agenda. So in identifying the problem, it's actually being able to call out the kind of patriarchy that is inherent in our built environments. The action is, and I stick to my point that you need to legislate on it. You need to actually target with legislation to demand for a fairer and more equitable society. And then the last is to be imaginative about what that fairer society looks like, because I really do believe that we are limited only by our own imagination. And that if we can dream for a better world, then that's where we begin. And then I think the question on stakeholders is really to, in some ways, decolonize this profession, that actually not everyone, and I mean that decolonization in terms of race, but also in terms of actually thinking about, other ways of creating an equitable society. So with in reference to gender and also culture. So who is an architect? Who I don't see my role as an architect as the person that comes in and tells a community, this is what you need. I think the architects, especially in the African context, which we've not traditionally had this kind of hierarchical system for building, is actually more of a cultural collaborator. They're a cultural curator. They're there to facilitate the ideas of communities and people and make their worlds more livable through good design. So we have to start to treat everyone as a fair, as an equal member of these conversations, and the design is about inclusive work. And so if we can really start to broaden who we consider a stakeholder, we're on the way there. The client is not your only stakeholder. As Stephanie mentioned, the client is sometimes, especially in public works, is hardly ever going to be the end user. So why do we not listen to the end user as much as we do the client? And this conversation about economy and the slow process, I think we need to not see the slow process as a loss, but it's actually, in the long term, it's actually a much more economically viable solution. That if you build something that cannot last 50 to 100 years and you have to replace it, I'd argue that that's less economically viable than if you'd really taken the time to think about the viability of your design work and the process of it. So I'd also say that the slow process is actually much cheaper than the sort of fast and quick, which leads to more losses. And actually that also economic success should not be our only target. That actually, if you can create a society that is fairer and much more can take into account the different people that use it, you actually will create a better economy, because everyone can participate and offer their best selves to the society. So that's why.
Great, thank you, Nana. Come and advocate with me.
I would love nothing more, so thank you.
Okay, so Stephanie, what are your last thoughts and the roles? Who can play what role in changing the thinking? Stephanie, you're also muted.
Sorry. So for people like you, Olamide, for example, who run the Lagos Urban Development Initiative, you have great ways of making suggestions to the government of how to improve their policies and their urban planning, for example. Now, me as an architect practicing, it would be, of course, great if I can also be included more in initiatives like that. But I think we all have our role to play in just making sure that our own projects follow the ideas that we also want them to achieve, and also have the guts to stand up for the ideas and to also walk away from certain situations and projects and just stand up for ourselves and for our ideas. I think that's what we all can do as individuals.
Amazing. Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you. And Tristan?
Sorry, I had to unmute myself. I think it's really great what everyone has said about external factors that can help to improve the situation of women in general in design. And but I also want to take it in a slightly different direction and put it also now on the women. We have a lot to do for ourselves. And you know, for any person, any race, any gender who has found themselves in an unfranchised position, it's a personal struggle and very intentional fight to push yourself forward and make sure you make that happen. There's the lottery of birth. We're all born in different places. You know, how well you do is not determined by where you are, but also what you do for yourself. And I think this is something that, coupled with external factors being addressed, you know, the individual. As women, we carry more than men. We bear children, you know, we run homes, and we still have to work. I always tell anyone who asks me, I run my life like a project. Everything has a time and place for everything. And as women, we are very intentional. And when we plan, we can achieve a lot. I always say, in a day, 24 hours, it's amazing what a woman will achieve, you know. And in that same 24 hours, people have not done anything. You know, we have to be intentional. We have to keep on pushing. You know, even with all the policy changes that are put in place, if women don't fight for the seat at the table, it's not going to happen. So we also have to keep in our minds that we need to make sure we go the extra mile, because irrespective of if it's an equal footing, by nature of our anatomy, we are always going to have to carry more load. And as long as we keep that in mind, I think that's very strong. Every woman who has done well and is successful has been able to break that barrier of the individual and herself. And we shouldn't forget that.
Great, amazing. Thank you, Tristan. Inspiring. And lastly, Dr. Lawrenson.
Okay, thank you. I think the main thing I want to say is that we must be intentional about creating platforms for women to thrive. That's one. The second one is that there are policies, affirmative action is there, but everybody's ignoring it. We need to speak up, you know, when these things happen. We need to demand, and we really need to unknot that tie that makes people not go on to practice, because you need the critical mass to be there to make the demand. So we need to find out why the discipline is not attractive post-study, and find a way to break, you know, that barrier. And more importantly, we need to be more intentional about seeking political influence, because the policies, the legislation, you know, and even the enforcement of the ones that are already there can only be done when you have political influence. And also they are quite, there's some men who are allies. We need to encourage them to speak out more and to be more intentional in their action and practice. It's good for a man to align and not just to put a woman in position, but let everybody know that I'm putting this person in position because we need to have a more inclusive society, and the person is competent and all that. So essentially there is need to speak out, and then there is need for more women to aspire for political influence, because that is when we can make the real change. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, all speakers, Stephanie, Nana, Tosin, Dr. Lanson. Really appreciate the time you've taken to kind of share your ideas, share your thoughts, discuss, and also to everyone who has joined us, kind of listen and participate in this discussion. I think it's really important that we keep discussing, but even more important that we start making actionable things, doing actionable things as well, so that we can all kind of move forward in this idea, not idea, but in this vision that we want to see a more equitable society, and where women can feel not just women can be can do more in society, but also feel safe, feel secure, and also take care of their families as well as themselves. So just thank you to everyone again. And as I said, there is a session at 6 o'clock on architecture education.
Sorry, Olamide, can we see the result of the Mentimeter?
Oh yeah, okay, sure. Let's do that as well, so that let's see what else people have said. Let me bring that up. Okay. Here we go. Not much more, but a little bit more functional, less testosterone-y, warmer, colorful green park sustainability, sustainable, empathetic, green, nook and crannier, glamorous, opinionated, imaginative, precise as well. So, I mean, I think safe and greener kind of have come up the most, which is why they're kind of the biggest words. But we'll try and save this as well and share it on our social media and share it with everyone as joined the discussion. I think it's really great to, and I think people have mentioned this, like this visioning aspect, because in society, so thanks again, everybody.
Well, thank you to you too. It was a pleasure.
Oh, yeah. Sorry, it cut off again. I was kind of making closing comments. And I don't know where I stopped, so I'll just end it there. So thank you for staying on as well while my internet played up. I really appreciate the time everyone has taken, both the speakers and the audience for joining. And as I said, there's a 6 o'clock discussion, so you can join back at 6 o'clock. Have a lovely evening, everyone, and weekend.